Hello, everyone. How are you doing tonight? Welcome, welcome. We have so much to discuss. These are very serious times. I probably won't go as long tonight as I usually do. I'm a little bit tired. I've been doing a lot of talking lately. It's been a little bit more busy for me in the last few days than normal, but there's so much going on. There's no way that I could not get on here and talk with you all tonight. There's no way I couldn't get on here and give everyone an update. Um, so let's talk. I'll also answer your super chats, but I've got plenty to update you on, as we all know. And I've got plenty of orange juice. So if you haven't done it already, now is the time to hit the like button. Now is the time to hit the subscribe button. Now is the time to hit the notifications bell. Now is the time to tweet this out and make this a bigger conversation. Thankfully, tonight we do have some moderators in the chat. So if, some crazy, Vosh fans or whatever try to give us trouble, why they'll be taken out of the chat. So that'll be good. Basically, we're ready to talk about things. I've got plenty of orange juice. It's late at night. No diet beverage right now, just orange juice. And we'll just jump right into it. So, as you all know, George Floyd, African-American man, was murdered by 4 police officers. The video is out there. It's very clear that this was not in any way justified. This was murder. And they've been arrested and charged with murder. Watch the video. And we know what usually happens. What usually happens when there is a police murder like this is we get 2 responses. We get the Democrat response, which is usually going short of calling out the cops. Usually the Democrats will say, wow, what a tragedy. They'll offer condolences to the family. They'll say, for example, there's distance between the police and the community. We need better relations. There needs to be peace in the community, end to the violence. They won't call out the police necessarily, but they'll try to mend the wound. And then you'll get the Republicans that'll be vicious, and they'll say, well, this person, they had a criminal record 15 years ago. They got arrested for pot, and they look at the video. They were being aggressive and disrespectful, and the Republicans will justify it on the one hand, and the Democrats will have a conciliatory tone. That's normally the way the political establishment in the United States responds. That was the situation with Freddie Gray in Baltimore. That was the situation in Ferguson. That was the situation, in New York City. That's generally what happens, right? And it's the far left that will call out the police and say this was murder, and this goes back for decades. This is kind of like this is post-World War II America. You can go back to the 60s when communist groups would hang up posters all over Harlem, wanted for murder, and with the cops' names after the cops killed somebody, and then be arrested for it. And this is generally the standard setup in American politics when there is police murder in the United States. When police needlessly kill somebody, they say they thought he had a gun or, whatever. When they kill somebody and try to justify it, the Republicans are the ones that are ruthlessly defending the cops. The Democrats are the ones that don't generally call out the cops. They just kind of try to smooth things over. That's the way it normally is. That's not the way it is right now. That is not the way politics is playing out right now. First of all, we've seen a huge upsurge in protests all over the country. The primary reason for that is the pandemic. Schools are closed. People don't have jobs. The economy is shut down. There's a lot of people that are sitting around their houses all day, bored and angry and worried about paying their bills and already facing a huge amount of economic anxiety. And so something like this happens. They're living in terror of police. People are being harassed by police. We know because of this pandemic, and the rage is building up and the rage is building up. They see that video, they're ready to go out and protest, right? And it's not like they're going to do something else because the economy is shut down. And so this is like a powder keg that has been lit. And you'll notice Trump immediately approached this with a conciliatory approach. He said, oh, I'm so outraged. I'm going to have a federal investigation. That was the Trump approach. The Democrats were immediately sympathetic. Everyone just condemned the cops immediately. But the protests spread, and they spread, and they spread. And at this point, there are protests that have happened, for 4 nights now, right? As we're speaking tonight, I guess I'll start with New York City, right? I understand that right now, even though it's well past dark here in New York City, it is well past dark in New York City. There are protests in Flatbush. There are police cars that have been burned in Flatbush. There were a number of arrests on the Brooklyn Bridge here in Brooklyn. And things are apparently pretty rough. I tweeted out some video that surfaced from here in Brooklyn of things going on. Now, earlier there were demonstrations during the day in Manhattan, and they were pretty calm from what I understand. I mean, they did take the street, unpermitted marchers on the street, but the police kind of held their hands off and the protesters marched. There were protests in Queens that were the same kind of way, where the protesters took the street, they protest, but there wasn't, pushing and shoving with the police. There weren't any arrests. It was pretty calm. However, now I did hear reports from Pittsburgh, and there were protests in Pittsburgh. Again, you don't hear about protests in Pittsburgh very much. Pittsburgh is, it used to be a big steel town. It's, deindustrialized. Great museum there, the Andy Warhol Museum. There's some theater there and stuff, but there's not much in Pittsburgh. But there were big protests in Pittsburgh. And from what we understand, the police cars that were burned in Pittsburgh, from people who were at that protest, they told me it was very obvious. It was very, very obvious that it was not protesters who burned those police cars in Pittsburgh. They said that those police cars, they told me those police cars that were burned in Pittsburgh were burned by undercover officers, that it was provocateurs. And I'm getting similar claims from around the country. People I've been on the phone with around the country who've been at protests have been telling me that police cars are being lit on fire. That's really happening, but it's not protesters doing it. There are these people from among the crowd who don't look like protesters and look a lot like cops, who go and light these things on fire, and people are saying provocateurs, provocateurs, provocateurs. There's a lot of provocateur activity going on right now. And that's what I'm seeing. And that's what people are telling me, that there is a lot of things being burned, buildings being burned, and police cars being burned, and it's not protesters who are doing it. It's undercover police officers, and that's very scary, folks. That is extremely scary. The other thing I'm seeing different reports about police officers being killed, but I notice they're not getting a lot of play. They're local news reports. National news doesn't seem to be talking about police officers being killed. I saw a report about a federal officer being killed. I've seen other reports about police officers' deaths. But then again, I'm not seeing them get national play. And that's very strange, right? I'm seeing that, usually if police officers are killed, that would be a national news story. I'm not seeing that, which is very, very, very strange. We saw Max Blumenthal's video, which was very odd, where, somebody got out of a car that looked like a police car. It looked like a police armored car, said he was with CNN. Then the people in the car wouldn't say they were with CNN. And so Max Blumenthal tweets out that the police are pretending to be CNN, and now he's apologized. He says that it actually was CNN, but it's very weird what's going on. And the person who Max Blumenthal, filmed as he walked out, they didn't look like a CNN reporter. They looked like a protester. They had the black bloc mask on. They looked like a protester. And they were in this car that they said was a CNN car. So why is CNN having people? What's going on there? Now, we did see also that the CNN headquarters has been besieged, right? And that explosives were thrown at the CNN headquarters. The other thing, Detroit. Someone drove up to the police brutality protest in Detroit and opened fire. A number of protesters were injured, and one of the protesters was killed by someone who drove up to the rally and opened fire. That's happening, right? We also saw today clashes at the White House, right? At the White House, in front of the White House, which they normally don't let you protest there. Thank you very much. And I heard the same thing about provocateurs. I will talk about that. And thank you. Yes, I did address a meeting on anti-imperialism with Australians. That's on there, and I'll talk about that later. I'll actually make that a OS webinar. All right, but yes, so we did see at the White House huge crowds protesting outside the White House, breaking through the barricades at the White House, pushing back, and from what we understand, Kamala Harris, the very likely pick for vice president by Joe Biden, Kamala Harris was among those protesters today. So quite interesting. Now Trump has tweeted out that when they start shooting or when they start looting, we start shooting. Right? And he's basically hinting that live rounds are going to start being fired at protesters at some point. What else have we heard? Neo-Nazis, white supremacists around the country are starting tomorrow going to be mobilizing against these demonstrations, and they're going to be assembling with firearms. That'll be happening, from what we understand, in West Virginia, in Pennsylvania, and other states. All the neo-Nazi web forums are basically calling for neo-Nazis to come to these rallies, and that they are basically tweeting out all the white supremacist, white separatist, neo-Nazi, Sig Heil, that crowd of very, very dangerous Nazi scum. They are tweeting out that this is the beginning of the race war, and they think this is the moment. And they are ready to this is their moment. They think that's very, very scary. Now, what else is happening? I mean, this is the situation we're in. It seems like the country is in a state of revolt. There are divisions in the ruling class, which we can get into. There are all kinds of contradictions here. But this is the situation. All over the country, people are protesting against police brutality. There is an economic crisis, mass unemployment, and the powder keg, the American powder keg, has been lit. That's the situation. Now, I'm going to first talk about, police brutality, right? I feel like this is an important moment of reckoning. You would think that this moment would have come during the Ferguson, Missouri protests during the Obama administration. You would think this would have happened in 2015 in Baltimore, with Freddie Gray. But it seems like this is a moment of reckoning, because my whole life, right, when the police kill somebody, when the police murder somebody, take their life, there is this huge section of the country, that is in total denial about it. I mean, if you talk to people who have police officers in their family, police officers who are, their uncle, their cousin, their dad, their brother, people that are in police officers' families often are in a state of delusion. It's almost like they're in a cult. Right? And they will sit there. No, there's no such thing as police brutality. Police brutality is something made up by the media to persecute cops. And they sit there, every police brutality case, no, it can't be, it's fake, it's not real, it was staged somehow. Don't you know there's this big conspiracy against cops, thin blue line. They sit there and you listen to them talk, and they live in this state of delusion. Furthermore, flowing from this, can you talk about quantitative changes to quality? Yeah, quality into quantity, sure. Yeah, all right. And they're just in a state of delusion. They think that police officers couldn't do anything wrong. And they also believe that in America's prisons, everyone has TV sets in their cells, and they get to play video games in their cells, which they absolutely do not get to do. And they believe the prisons are paradises, and that criminals are being treated really, really well. And they believe, I mean, it's kind of scary. You talk to people that are the Fraternal Order of Police, and this kind of mindset that develops among police officers and their families. There's never been a such thing as police brutality. Racism doesn't exist. Police especially are not racist, and criminals, there's no problem with, criminals are just, treated so nicely in America, and criminals have it better than average citizens. Criminals are just doing so well. I mean, they believe this. And if you've ever talked to somebody who comes from a police officer family, they sit there and they believe this. They believe that, all those things I just said, which are completely out of touch with reality. I mean, we have a huge prison industrial complex in this country. Our prison system is definitely not a paradise. It's not a nice place to be. It's a pretty awful situation that a lot of these prisoners are in. But they live in a world of delusion. They just live in this world of delusion where there is no problem. There's clearly a problem between the African American community and the police, and it's a long-standing problem. And it used to be the only people that talked about it were the far left. It used to be, the black nationalists talked about it. Yes, the Nation of Islam, the Black Panther Party started out with their armed patrols that began in the black community to protect the black community from police brutality. In the 60s, there were a lot of urban rebellions around the country. Communist groups talked about this and were involved in these protests. But mainstream society, most of the Democrats ignored it. That's not the issue. And increasingly, I'll talk about Falun Gong. All right. Increasingly, we've become more and more aware of this. And when Barack Obama took office, many people believed that Barack Obama's presidency would solve this problem. that finally there'd be a man at the top office in the United States who was dark skinned and understood the frustrations the black community has, and that was going to point toward the end of this problem. And that didn't happen, right? Early on, we saw in Barack Obama's presidency, when Barack Obama's professor Henry Louis Gates, was arrested in his own home. He got locked out of his own house and tried to get back in, and the police arrested him for breaking into his own home. Barack Obama said that the police had acted stupidly in arresting them, and it turned into this big thing. And the media said Barack Obama was disrespecting police officers, and he invited both Henry Louis Gates and the officer who wrongfully arrested him to the White House. They drank beer together, and Obama was bringing the country together. And then we saw what happened in Baltimore, or we saw Ferguson and then Baltimore, and it seemed like the anger at police brutality was more intense. It was more intense because there had been such high hopes and such an expectation that the Democrats would address this, that Barack Obama would lead us toward a more perfect union, a post-racial America, as he promised, right? He gave that speech where he talked about, his racist grandmother and why he wouldn't condemn his pastor. And it was Barack Obama was supposed to lead the United States out of any racial difficulties. It didn't happen, right? And by the time Obama was leaving office, there was more racial tension than ever. There had been Baltimore exploding into flames. There had been protests all over the country. The Black Lives Matter movement. Things were really exploding. And it seemed like a lot of liberals, at least, a lot of people that were like white Democrats, had kind of broken out of their denial and were starting to actually admit there's an issue. And that was big. And it seemed like among people that are just, white Democrats, white liberals, there was this admission of the fact that there's an issue. There's an issue between the black community and the police. And what was interesting was also during the Obama years, we noticed that there started to increasingly be a lot of police brutality against white people, right? Not because they were white, don't get me wrong. It wasn't because they were white. It was just because they're part of the working class, right? And that the economic crisis has accompanied this big crackdown, this big crackdown on the community. And thank you, Aspie for Peace. I appreciate it. I'm glad you like my work. But, that there was this big crackdown on society, right? There was a case in Florida where there was a white teenage girl who was in handcuffs. And she tried to walk away in the handcuffs, right? And so the police officer tased her. He tased her, right, as she was walking away in the handcuffs. She's handcuffed, so she can't hold up her hands, so she hit her head and she died. And there started to be no-knock raids where the police, they would have a warrant. It was usually federal officers would believe that somebody had firearms that were illegal or something like that. They would go to their home to raid them for having illegal firearms or drugs or whatever, just with a warrant, right? The person's not been convicted of a crime. It's just they suspect there's something illegal in the household. So they go to raid the person's home. They don't knock on the door. They have a special warrant. I keep thinking about these current riots and the mental struggle of what to think about what's happening. You're on this. I don't know what the question is, but they do these no-knock raids, and the person doesn't know who's, they just know someone's kicked down their door and is waving a gun at them, so they shoot back, right? And that happens, right? I mean, and there's been a lot of federal officers and police officers killed in no-knock raids where the person has a gun, right? And they don't knock on the door and say, hey, we're here to deliver this warrant. They come in with guns blazing, and so if the person themselves is armed, they will shoot back. And it turns into a firefight. And that's been happening across the United States with these no-knock raids that have been going on. And so we've seen a number of white people dying at the hands of police officers as well. Nowhere near the African American community's numbers. It's not because, it's different circumstances. But there's a feeling increasingly among white Americans that the government is out of control. The government is taking away their rights. The state is coming for them. And that increasingly this feeling that our rights are being taken away, our civil liberties are being taken away, the state is coming to get us, we are losing our freedom. This feeling is rising across the United States. And I have been beating the drum that now is the time for solidarity. Now is the time for solidarity. Now is the time for the white community, white people, to say, you know what? We're mad about police brutality, and the black community has been suffering from police brutality far longer than we have. Now is the time to have a national conversation about getting our police and law enforcement under control. And now is the time for the entire country to be protesting against the rising low-wage police state. I've been saying that for a long time. But unfortunately, I've seen the opposite until now, right? I've seen the opposite. Largely what I've seen is, is the white people that are mad about the police state. Thoughts on Robespierre. Okay, we'll write that down. What we've seen is the white people that are mad about the police state opposing the protests, right? And they've been saying that the black community, this is a plot by evil Democrats and socialists for a race war. I'm writing it down, Grover Fur. It's an evil plot by socialists for a race war, and and they're all socialists and communists, and it's a federal liberal conspiracy. The Alex Jones crowd, that's what they say, right? They talk about police brutality and repression of different people, but whenever it's the black community, their response tends to be, they deny it against the people of color. And then when we see instances, against white people, there'll be this response, it would be worse if they were black, or people only care about this because they were white, which may be true. But again, not solidarity, not a call for solidarity. And that's a problem. It's a big problem, and that we need solidarity more than anything. And yes, we have to recognize that the black community are the ones who suffer from this more than anybody. And that what they have been through is far worse, right? Anyone who tries to trivialize that or say that it's equal or vice versa or try to make those kind of claims, I have no tolerance for that, right? But at the same time, now is the time for solidarity. Now is the time for solidarity, and now is the time to recognize the low-wage police state. Now, racism in the United States, the Russian Revolution of 1917, it might sound like it's completely unrelated to what we're talking about, but when the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, that was one of the biggest events in pushing forward the struggle of black people in the United States. That might sound outrageous, and people did not know that in 1917. People had no idea in 1917 how much of an impact the Bolshevik Revolution would have on the black freedom struggle. But the Communist International was formed, the Comintern. And communists all over the world, communist parties were formed to join the Comintern. And the Comintern directed American communists to focus on opposing racism, right? That's just a fact. Lenin had developed his concept of the national question, and the Communist International investigated the black issue in the United States and determined that black people were a nation. They were a colonized people within the United States. And the Communist Party, USA, and the Communist International demanded independence for the Black Belt. Right? The Black Belt is a region in the U.S. South, Atlanta, Georgia. I'm sorry, not Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia is a city, but Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, that area. It's called the Black Belt because of the soil, and it even to this day remains overwhelmingly majority African American. That's where the slave plantation system was concentrated. And the Communist International called for, if the black community wanted it, to grant the right of secession to the Black Belt. If the black community chose to have a separate black republic, they would have the right to secede as a nation, as a colonized people. And that was the Comintern position, the Black Belt South position. And if you look at old Communist Party posters from the 1930s, they actually had maps, right? When William Z. Foster ran for president in 1932, there's a poster of the United States, and it says, independence, self-independence for the Black Belt. And it has a map of this region, the Black Belt, where impoverished African Americans lived in huge numbers. And it was calling for self-determination, the right to secede for that area, if that area wanted to secede from the United States. That's big. That's very, very big. Since then, we've seen communists talk about Aztlan and the Sun Belt and the fact that, there's a large chunk of the United States that was stolen from Mexico. And there are people in that region, in Aztlan, who have always lived there. They've spoken Spanish. They've always lived there. But yet now that it was seized from Mexico, they are treated, essentially like they are foreigners or something in their own land. The Chicano people, right? They would chant, we didn't cross the border crossed us, right? That Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California were seized from Mexico. They were seized from Mexico by the United States. And that the people who lived there were then, in many, over the course of generations, deported from the country. That's not right, right? And that there were many communists in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, they didn't talk about this in the 30s, who called for separation or independence for Aztlan. And you had the Chicano moratorium, which was big demonstrations, right? In addition, there's the Native Americans, right? And that, we know the Black Hills was it was granted in treaties to the Sioux Nation. And then, because gold was discovered there, all of a sudden the U.S. government went back on that treaty and kicked them out of there. And that's what sparked a lot of the fighting, the last wars between Native Americans and the U.S. government with, Crazy Horse and all of that. Those fights were about the fact that the Black Hills had been granted to Native Americans and then taken from them. And there were many communist groups that also raised the returning of the Black Hills, the returning of the Black Hills to indigenous groups. So, these things have gone on. The national question within the United States is very important, right? And the understanding that black people, many black activists like Malcolm X, like the Black Panthers, like Harry Haywood, like the Republic of New Africa, many black people do feel that they are a colonized people within U.S. borders, and some favor separation. They favor an independent black republic in the South. I would say the majority of African Americans at this point, based on what I know, based on observations, it's not like I've taken a poll, most African Americans, while they may consider black people to be a nation, are not at the point they're ready to call for separation. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I haven't taken a poll. But that understanding that if black people wanted to separate from the United States, that I think a communist would support that, right? A communist would make clear that if this group of people wanted to separate, and if they voted and they overwhelmingly wanted to separate, they had the right to do that. But if they don't want to separate, which I think at this point is the feeling of the black community, then you wouldn't call for that. And that's why it gets a little bit weird, right? When you see different communist groups calling for the black belt, it almost sounds like segregation, right? It sounds like we're going to take all the black people and put them in a separate country. It sounds like segregation. So you, as a white activist, you can't exactly, it looks a little bit weird. And that's the truth is that the communists in the 1930s, when they were calling for the independence of the black belt, they sounded and looked a little bit weird, right? And it was a little bit awkward the way they called for it, right? But if you want to understand the history of the Communist International and how they related to the black question, you really need to study Black Bolshevik by Harry Haywood. That is a memoir of a leader of the Communist Party USA from the 1930s, and he wrote it in the 70s when he was a leader of the Maoist movement. It's a very big book. I mean, it's well over 500 pages, and he goes into great detail about the history of communism and the national question. And it's you should investigate it. I mean, you have to study this. And unfortunately, neo-Nazi type people like to distort this all the time. They like to say, oh, communists believe in segregation. Look at the black belt. Well, no, they don't believe in segregation. They don't. They believe that if black people wanted to, they would have the right to an independent territory. But no one would be deported from the United States or whatever. If black people wanted to separate from the country, they would have that right. That was the Comintern position. The Communist International, the Communist Party stopped talking that way in 1935 when they formed the Popular Front. They started to no longer advocate a black belt South. They took it out of their platform. Then after World War II, when Earl Browder, who was the leader of the Communist International, who was considered to be just a sellout and a phony, when Earl Browder was deposed from the leadership of the Communist Party, and they reestablished the Communist Party in 1945 at the end of World War II, when William Z. Foster triumphed and became like the leader of American communism, they reestablished that position, right? And that was when they really came down hard with that position. Claudia Jones, who was a Caribbean American, who was a leader of the Communist Party, she wrote a harsh polemic against Earl Browder for denouncing the national question and reversing that position. Paul Robeson was in favor of the Black Belt South, and it was kind of seen as the Communist Party becoming anti-imperialist again. There was a feeling that the Communist Party of the United States had, during the Second World War, kind of kind of glossed over the fact that U.S. imperialism existed. And so that was a way that the Communist Party could reestablish its anti-imperialism. And, and at that point, the Communist Party formed the Civil Rights Congress, which was organizing for civil rights. And I mean, and you read about what was done to the Civil Rights Congress. A leader of the Civil Rights Congress died under mysterious circumstances. Many believe she was assassinated. The Civil Rights Congress was declared to be a subversive organization by the U.S. federal government. And basically what they did is they tried to save black people from getting the death penalty in the South. Because in the South, a lot of times, black men would be accused of rape. There'd be no evidence whatsoever, and they would just go right to the electric chair. And it happened all the time in the South. And so the Communist Party formed the Civil Rights Congress. And the Civil Rights Congress would represent black people that were charged with rape or murder or something like that, and fight for their rights. And Willie McGee was a very famous case where he was very clearly not guilty. And the Communist Party, that was one thing that they did. W.E.B. Du Bois, considered one of the most well-known African-American scholars, eventually joined the Communist Party. He was an ally of the Communist Party. He was a member of the Civil Rights Congress. The Communist Party also took a petition to the United Nations, and the Soviet Union presented to the UN General Assembly a document called We Charge Genocide, written by William L. Patterson, who was a leader of the Communist Party, talking about racism in the United States, the oppression of black people, and such. That was presented in 1951. And so this is at a moment where the Communist Party was being just hit with McCarthyism. They were supporting black nationalism. They were supporting the black community, and they were really doing a lot. They were like the vanguard of anti-racism. Right? It was later, in 1954, that the Montgomery bus boycott happened, and you had Northern liberals start to talk about civil rights and such. And there was a fight in the Democratic Party between the Kennedy family and Northern New England liberals versus the Southern Democrats, and the Northern wing of the Democrats, and the AFL labor union, the AFL-CIO labor union, and some other voices started openly opposing racism. But the Communist Party was way ahead of it. The Communist Party always saw race as essential. One little known fact that I think is very important when we're talking about all of this is that, in South Africa, right, after the Communist International was formed, in South Africa, the Communist Party of South Africa was formed. And their original manifesto had white supremacy in it. And it said they were a party for white people only, etc. And the Communist International told them that they were not welcome in the Communist International unless they opposed racism. So the Communist Party of South Africa was dissolved. And a new party was formed that was anti-racist because the Comintern said they would not tolerate such things. I think that's fascinating. And we know that it was the Communist Party of South Africa that eventually built the African National Congress. That was the party of Nelson Mandela. That was the party that toppled the apartheid government. So I think that's very, very fascinating. That goes back to all of this. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a huge boost to the struggle of black people in the United States. Malcolm X discusses this. He talks about the Congress of the colonized people around the world. This is widely recognized, and this is something we can't gloss over. Now, I want to talk about what's going on now. William Jennings Bryan. Yeah, we'll talk about it. I want to talk about what's going on now because how do we relate to what's going on now? How do we relate to it? I mean, what do we do in this time? I mean, there's a book that is probably the most important tactical book in the history of Marxism. It's called, I said, what do we do now? It's called What Is to Be Done. It's written by Vladimir Lenin. What is to be done? And if you read What Is to Be Done, this is the document that Vladimir Lenin wrote when arguing for the formation of the Bolshevik Party. And if you read What Is to Be Done, it's very much an argument. And he's talking about how the Russian Marxist movement could make a revolution. And he pitches the concept of the party of a new type. He talks about bowing to spontaneity. He talks about tailism. He talks about terrorism. He talks about all this stuff. And if you're following these protests, I would recommend opening up What Is to Be Done. Right? In What Is to Be Done, Lenin talks about how spontaneity by itself doesn't lead to revolutions. Right? Revolutions don't happen because everyone's mad and they just can't take it anymore, so they go out and have a revolution. That's not the case, right? And that spontaneity left unto itself doesn't really lead to overthrowing the system, right? That revolutionary organizations have to exist, and that's what is to be done. That's Lenin. And that if revolutionary organizations don't exist, right, and if there's just spontaneity, it's not going to lead to anything. And furthermore, that revolutionary organizations can't just bow to spontaneity. They can't just chase after what's happening. That's called tailism, right? And it's, when there is an uprising of the people, running after it and saying, "Yay!" That is not what revolutionaries should do. That doesn't lead to a revolution. And Lenin, he writes about how at the time in Russia, that's what Marxists would do. There would be a strike someplace, and the communists would all show up and say, "Yes, we support it." And, the workers are already on, there would be an uprising among the peasants, right? And the communists would all, applaud for it and run to it and say, "Yay, we support it." That doesn't really do anything, right? Lenin said that without revolutionary theory, there is not a revolutionary movement, and that spontaneity on its own and bowing to spontaneity and tailism doesn't create a revolution. And that the job of revolutionaries is to be ahead of the masses, not behind them, right? It's to be ahead of them and putting forward demands and slogans that can push them forward. The job of revolutionaries is to be ahead of the masses and to bring the masses forward. It's not to tail behind them, right? And that's one thing he makes very clear. He also criticizes terrorism and left adventurism and violence. And he says this illusion, right? And a lot of times, in Lenin's day, anarchists, ultra-leftists would get this idea that they were going to go do some crazy act of terrorism. And by doing that, then everyone would wake up, and that would be the spark that would light the prairie fire, etc. But it doesn't work that way. What happens is that tends to lead to people being isolated from the revolutionaries. They see the revolutionaries as crazy, violent extremists, and they want nothing to do with them. And it leads to an isolation, and it leads to a government crackdown on revolutionary groups, and it's not something that revolutionaries do. Revolutionaries don't engage in left adventurism and terrorism. And people are telling me that around the country, these police cars that are being lit on fire are being lit on fire by police provocateurs. The protesters are not doing that. Meanwhile, we've got Trump tweeting out, if they start looting, he's going to start shooting. And honestly, I am terrified right now that there is going to be mass slaughter of these protesters, that they are going to open up on these protesters, that people are going to die. And my fear is that they are setting the stage with these provocative acts that are not being done by protesters, from what I hear. I mean, maybe they are. I understand some people have been arrested or whatever, but I'm hearing reports that people that are there at these demonstrations tell me that it's not protesters doing these things, right? And if that's the case, right, and if police provocateurs are engaging in these actions, right, this could very well set the stage for murder. We hear Trump talking about live ammunition. And all of us who are following this have a responsibility not to let this happen, not to let them go in and murder these protesters, not let them ruthlessly take lives, in the name of public safety, right? We know that people have been hurt already. Protesters have been shot. We know, there's been police officers, according to some reports, that have been killed. Again, it's weird that they're not making a bigger deal out of this in the media. You would think they would be. Very strange, but we have to make clear that the government has no right to come in and slaughter these people that are protesting. That protesting is your right. The U.S. Constitution says you have the right. It is in the First Amendment to peaceably assemble and for the redress of grievances. That's in the Constitution. And I've also heard some other stuff. I've heard that in different parts of the country, more motorcycles, right? I've heard in different parts of the country that there are people who assemble peacefully, and the police say, "Oh, you can't have a rally because of the pandemic," and then just immediately start tear gassing people, right? We've heard about this, right? That they don't give them any warning, and they start tear gassing people to break them up, and that's happening around the country as well. And this is a very, very dangerous situation. But again, the question that keeps coming up, and it came up, I did a conversation earlier on Discord with some young revolutionaries on TikTok. The question that keeps coming up is this a revolution? And the answer is no, okay? It may feel that way. This is certainly a greater time of upsurge than we've had, in my lifetime, okay? I've never seen this level of political upsurge going on. But this isn't a revolution, because revolutions are not made simply by spontaneity. This is spontaneity. That's what this is. This is spontaneity. Okay? And that, again, I hate to sound like a broken record. If you're somebody who regularly listens to these conversations, you'll have heard this, but we need a revolutionary people. We need a culture. We need institutions. We need socialist food banks. We need socialist, poverty programs. We need socialists, socialist community centers, right? That you have to have an organization. You have to have infrastructure. You have to have political infrastructure. You have to have a widespread understanding of socialist ideas. We have none of that in the United States right now. A revolution, as I've repeated, and I will repeat, according to Lenin, a revolution requires three things. It requires a serious crisis in society, in which the crisis is spreading even into the ruling class. It requires great upheavals and rebellions among the masses of people, and it requires a revolutionary movement that can transform those revolutionary upheavals into a revolution. And we, at this point, yes, we have a serious crisis in society. Two, we're starting to see the beginnings of mass upheaval, the beginnings of it, the beginnings, right? We're seeing a lot of chaos, the beginnings of it. But we absolutely do not have anything near, how long? We don't have anything near how long protests last. We don't have anything near. We just have nothing near a revolutionary movement, right? The revolutionary organizations are weak, and the people that have been at these protests, I've been talking to people on the phone all day, getting reports from different people. The people who've been at these protests are telling me that, they see one or two of the groups, but, they're not really represented, right? This is spontaneity, right? We need revolutionary ideology. We need revolutionary perspective, and until people's understanding of socialism and concepts like socialism is expanded, things are not going to change. There's not going to be a transition towards socialism in the United States based on people going out and breaking stuff. Okay, #revolution will not lead to socialism. I'm sorry to break it to you. It may feel very liberatory. You may be very mad at the system. You may be very mad about police brutality. And I'm all for people exercising their right to protest. Okay. Writing it down, Sami. I'm all for people protesting, but I'm just telling you that #revolution, people going out and breaking stuff, and certainly not left adventurist activity, people going out and burning things and doing stuff like that, which, from what I understand, may not be even being done by any protesters. But regardless, that doesn't make a revolution. It doesn't make a revolution. It doesn't make a revolution. Okay. It doesn't make a revolution. What parties? Ben is asking me what parties. Well, I haven't been in any of these protests, so I'm not really the person to ask, but, I'm writing it down, Ben. All right, but that doesn't make a revolution. It doesn't make a revolution. It just simply doesn't make a revolution. And that I worry, my fear, I feel like people are being set up to be murdered right now. And that's my fear. And that we, all of us, have a responsibility not to let the government murder these protesters, not to let them gun them down. When Trump says things like, they start looting, we start shooting, he's psyching the population up. He's psyching the population up for mass murder. And we have a responsibility to not let that happen, right? And we have to do that. Now, let's be real, okay? There's a fight within the ruling class right now. Okay, Trump, as I've said before, he represents lower levels of capital. The ultra-rich don't like Trump. And it seems to me that right now, there's a feeling that Trump has totally mishandled this pandemic, totally just been deeply irresponsible with the pandemic. And there is a feeling that some sections of the ruling class think they can use this to drive Trump out of office, okay? They think that this is their opportunity. Russiagate didn't work. They were hoping they could do it on the basis of Russiagate because they want to hate everyone to hate Russia because it's an anti-imperialist country. Didn't work. Russiagate was this stupid CNN spy story that didn't buy it. The population either didn't buy it or just didn't care. They were trying to drive Trump out with Russiagate, and everyone kind of yawned and got confused. And Carter Page and Michael Flynn and what's going on? The population, Russiagate didn't work. Okay, they weren't able to drive out Trump with Russiagate. So now it seems that the forces that wanted to drive out Trump with Russiagate are going to try to use this moment. And the thing is, though, Russiagate was fake news. Okay. I mean, there was no vast Russian conspiracy to elect Trump. I mean, that's just fact if you looked into the details. There was no there. Okay? But, there's something here. George Floyd was murdered. Police brutality, is a big problem. Black people get murdered by police. This is a real thing. This is a real crisis. There's real anger. There's real rage at the police for what they've done. And there would have been an uprising and protests against this regardless. But it appears that there are sections of the ruling class in the United States that see this as an opportunity to push against Trump. That's why Kamala Harris was out with the protesters in D.C. by the White House today. And that's why CNN seems to be encouraging people to go. I mean, I have never seen anything like this. I mean, CNN sounds like Democracy Now! Or something right now. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. Okay? And that's a moment when that happens, right? We have to do a double take. Okay, we as revolutionaries, we can't just go, great, CNN agrees with us. We should do a double take and go, what's going on here? What's going on here, okay? We have to do a double take, right? And if you're not doing a double take, when you see CNN give your opinion and you call yourself an anti-imperialist and a Marxist, you have to do a double take. You have to go, whoa, what's going on here? That doesn't mean you should change your opinion, but you have to go, whoa, what's going on here? And the fact that CNN is just egging on these protests, there's something going on here. And I think that what's going on is that there are entities within the ruling class that think that this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to remove Trump, right? We saw, CNN headquarters was attacked. So it's not like these protesters these are real people with real anger, okay? These people aren't agents. They're not paid by Soros. Okay, these are real people with real anger. But there's divisions in the ruling class about this. And there's a crisis right now. People are in the streets. And I will say, like I said earlier, the right wing is being rather muted, right? And that makes me mad. But it also makes me want to go, I almost want to get mad, but I also kind of want to just smirk at them. Dinesh D'Souza, who's a piece of crap. I mean, I hate Dinesh D'Souza. Right? He says that Native Americans weren't really killed. They died from disease. He says Hitler was a Marxist, which is ridiculous. Hitler hated Marxism. But Dinesh D'Souza tweets out, I just saw the murder, and I'm outraged by it. Really? Well, where were you when Freddie Gray was killed? All these people that every time a black person is murdered by the police, every time they get on there and go, he deserved it, and they just make all these stupid excuses for the police. Police don't do anything wrong. That never happens. Police don't do anything wrong. This is just a radical left agenda. These people are communists who hate America. All those voices that do that. Every time. This time, they know what's going on with the pandemic. They know how bad this is, and they're going, oh shit. I mean, right? Charlie Kirk, one of these right-wing pieces of crap, right? Charlie Kirk, he gets on there, and he says, burning buildings won't bring back George Floyd. I'm sorry, this is Charlie Kirk. This is someone who thinks that, that Barack Obama is a socialist just like Genghis Khan. And that's all they got. Like, they're slowing down with this. The right wing, I think, is very afraid. They're very afraid. Just like we're sitting here going, I feel like people are getting set up to be murdered. I'm worried about, the protesters being killed. The right wing is sitting here going, oh no, don't put this on us. They're looking behind their backs, right? Look at the posts they put out. Look at what Candace Owens and all of them, all these right wing voices are saying. They're looking over their shoulder, right? I have a feeling they may not even think what they're writing. They may be just taking the police's side personally, but they're looking over their shoulder. And they're going, oh shit. And that tells you something. This is a bigger explosion than I've ever seen. This is big. This is very, very big. And I'm going to conclude my opening segment here, right? We've been going for almost an hour now, 49 minutes. I'm going to conclude by repeating because I know some of you are with us that are new. I'm going to repeat what's going on in the country, the big problem. The problem is this. Capitalism is a system where production is carried out for profit. Under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. That's what Frederick Engels said it, right? Buildings don't get built because people, need a place to live. They get built so banks can make money from them. They get built so landlords can make money renting them out, right? Food isn't produced so people can eat it. Food is produced so agribusiness and big box stores can make money selling it. Capitalism is the system of production for profit. As Mao Zedong said, capitalism is profits in command. That's the essence of what capitalism is. And under capitalism, the capitalist is always looking to make the most profit. That's what motivates him to build things and create things. And in order to do that, he likes to increase the efficiency of production with technology, make it cheaper and cheaper to produce goods. And with technology, you can eliminate workers from the assembly line. The fewer workers you have to hire, the more money you make. They make the workers that do exist, they de-skill them. They de-skill workers. They make them easier to replace so they can pay them less, and the technological advances under capitalism have made capitalism a very, very problematic system. Why? In the past, people were hungry because there wasn't enough food. But under capitalism, people are hungry because there is too much food. In the past, people were homeless because there were shortages of housing. Under capitalism, people are homeless because there's too much housing, right? This is the reality of the capitalist system, right? Capitalism is production for profit, and it leads to, as more efficient production becomes, more that's produced, the more people are hungry, right? There's a famous story of a coal miner, right? And it's freezing cold in the winter. And his son says, "Dad, why is it so cold in this house?" And he says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine, and I can't afford to buy us any coal to heat the house." And he says, "Dad, why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" And he says, "Because there is too much coal." That's capitalism. And in capitalism, when there are huge technological leaps, it creates a crisis, right? World War I, World War I basically happened because of huge technological leaps, right? Technology had, advanced. All kinds of workers were eliminated from the assembly line. As a result, there was mass unemployment. The market was glutted with products that couldn't be sold. When people don't have jobs, workers are also consumers. When people lose their place at the assembly line, when their wages drop down because they're so easy to replace, they can't buy. And soon the market is glutted with products that can't be sold. The Great Depression of the 1930s that gave birth to Hitler, that gave birth to fascism in World War II, was spawned by Henry Ford's breakthroughs in assembly line production. When they started, churning out cars in assembly lines, producing things so efficiently, it resulted in mass unemployment. And that's what happens. Capitalism causes overproduction. The market becomes glutted with products that can't be sold. The people become hungry and starving and unable to buy the products. As a result, the market crashes. And everything the capitalists have done to try and resolve this doesn't work. They invented a Federal Reserve banking system. Didn't work. They invented Social Security and unemployment insurance. They've done everything to try and hold off this natural problem of their system, but it doesn't work. It does not work. This is the built-in problem of capitalism. And that's all there is to it, right? The only way out of this is socialism. The banks, factories, and industries, the centers of economic power, must be organized to serve public good and not profits. You need an economy that's organized to serve the people. You need production to be organized to serve the people, not profits in command. You need a planned economy. And that's the way out of this contradiction, where no more will greater efficiency mean greater poverty, right? In a rational socialist economy, greater efficiency means there's less work for everyone to do. It means greater wealth for society, right? It eliminates that contradiction where efficiency and technological advancement creates poverty. That's socialism. This is what Marx wrote about in Capital. And right now, the computer revolution has created the biggest crisis of overproduction in all of human history. At this point, we've got 3D printers. At this point, they have print-on-demand machines where you push a button and a book comes out. They used to have book binderies where people would spend all day binding books. Now they push a button and a book comes out. Okay, we are 2 or 3 years away from self-driving cars. Okay, that would eliminate Uber drivers. That would eliminate truck drivers. That would eliminate millions and millions of jobs. Okay. Technology is eliminating people. We have machines that can trade stocks more effectively and more predictably than people can. Everything is being done by machines. And this is the built-in long-term problem of overproduction. And the only way out of it is socialism. And the capitalists know that. They know there are millions of people who no longer have a place at their assembly line. They used to need millions of people to produce, cars and steel and textile and all kinds of things. They don't need them anymore. There are millions of people around the world that they don't need anymore. And they don't know what to do about it, right? And they're talking about overpopulation. The problem is overpopulation. They're talking about, for the environment's sake, we got to drop their living standards. They're trying to resolve this problem that they have no place for millions of people because they're not profitable any longer. And that's the problem that we're in. That is the crisis we are in. The capitalists are trying to figure out how they can transition everyone to a lower standard of living, because we are in a crisis, because capitalism no longer has a place for them. That's what they're trying to figure out how to do. And they know that Trump and Bernie Sanders are just the beginning. Millions of people who've been cast out of society, have no place, right? Maybe they're young, they're stuck in low-wage, short-term service sector jobs, right? Maybe they're in prison. That's why we have a prison industrial complex. They've turned to locking people in jail. Wow, Shaniqua is saying that Buffalo, New York is under curfew. BPD very savage. National Guard on the streets in Buffalo, New York. Wow. I didn't know that. Buffalo, New York is under National Guard. Patrol. That's crazy. That's the situation we're in. This is big. I have never seen anything like this. That's the situation we're in. Capitalism has created an economic crisis that it cannot escape. And the ruling class is trying to manage this crisis, and they're fighting amongst themselves, trying to figure out how they deal with this new reality of the fact that there are millions of people at the assembly line who they have no place for. And as a result, that's the problem. I see people saying that Los Angeles is also under curfew. This is the situation, folks, right? The country is in a state of rebellion. And the root problem is the crisis of overproduction. The only way the crisis of overproduction can be solved is with a rationally planned economy. And I am all for people protesting. I am all for people exercising their rights and speaking up against the low-wage police state, saying that we're not going to be pushed out of society, saying we're not going to be imprisoned, we're not going to be locked down, we're not going to be, relegated to poverty, we're not going to be, we're not going to suffer this way, we're not going to let you just write us out of your economy because we're not profitable. I'm all for people doing that, but I'm telling you that in and of itself, hashtag revolution, chaos on the streets, that in and of itself does not and will not lead to the way out of this. The only way out of this is socialism. And understanding socialist concepts and ideology. That's why I'm devoted to building the Center for Political Innovation. If we can ever get off the ground, if this pandemic ever ends, we need to start raising revolutionary consciousness. We need to build a socialist community. We need to be in neighborhoods. We need to get out of the movement. We need to get to the masses. We need to start caring for people and feeding people. And we need to build a socialist community to get us out of this nightmare created by capitalism in crisis, right? That's what we need to do. Socialism is the only way out of this. It'll be American socialism. It'll be a unique socialism. David Fox says, comrades, stay safe. Bigger fight ahead. Justin Simons just gave a very, very generous super chat, and it's deeply appreciated. Yes, the country's on the brink. We're all very afraid right now. But this is a moment to talk about how important our project is. So now that I've gotten that off my chest, I've given you a lowdown on what's going on. Now I'm going to pour some more orange juice. And we can do our little shout out. We can do our shout out and see who's with us tonight. I know people are around from all across the country tuning into this. It's great that there are people watching. So, names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Who's here? Names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. I know there's people from Buffalo watching. There's people from LA watching. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Liverpool, UK. Dallas, Texas. George from Minnesota. Chicago. Detroit, Athens, Greece, Madison, Wisconsin, Mississippi, New Jersey, Dayton, Ohio, Michael in Ithaca, New York, Mick in Australia, hi from Washington, Argentina, Cleveland, Anthony Penza, California, Iran, Joe Gale in Nassau County, Lima, Peru, San Francisco, Shaniqua from Buffalo, New York, St. Andrews, Scotland, Salem, Oregon, John Doe from Australia, Alberta, Canada, Cleveland, Pirate Alex, Robert from Texas, Jacksonville, Florida, Toronto, Galen Henderson, Bendigo, Australia, David Fox, big fan of the show, New York, Ithaca, New York, Toronto, Ali Nakvi, Bauxite, the Philippines, Louisiana, Beijing, Jack Dundee, hi from Buffalo, says Brian Jakowski, Regina, Canada, Hawaii, Florida, Louisiana, Pensacola, Wilmington, Delaware, Argentina, Atlanta, Georgia, Ophelia and Ramiro in Los Angeles, Greeley, Colorado, San Leandro, California, Fresno, California, Michael from Akron, Ohio, Michigan, Pomona, California. We've got Miguel from Puerto Rico, Portland, Oregon. Wow. Somewhere, says Wolfgang. Phoenix, Arizona, says nickname. San Diego, says Tommy Farras. Ling from Melbourne. Worldwide Outrage, Worldwide Revolt, says Digital Pitch. Nick from New Jersey. In a capitalist system, what can a small business owner do? Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. I totally agree with that. What was the rest of the question about revolutionary theory, or what can a small business owner do? What was the rest of the question? I couldn't see it all. Washington State is with us. San Ramon, California. Frank from Baltimore. What was the rest of the question about small business owners? What was the rest of the question about small business owners? And I agree that without a revolutionary movement, capitalist business owner believes in socialism but also has to employ people. Okay, I'll talk about that. I'll write that on my list of things. Small business owner. But yes, without a revolutionary theory, there is no revolutionary movement. That's why I was quoting What Is to Be Done earlier. There you go. Okay, so why don't we start talking about these super chats people have sent me. Okay, so someone thanked me for being on the webinar with the Australia-Venezuela Solidarity Network. That was fun. I had a great time on the webinar. I recorded my audio of my presentation about what imperialism is. I put the video up, but it was great. I mean, there were people from Bulgaria on there. There were people from Chile on there. There were people from all over Australia, different parts. It was really a pleasure to be on there. Some people that regularly watch these broadcasts were on there, and it was really fun. Tim Anderson, who's a great anti-imperialist writer, professor, he was on there. He gave a great presentation. I believe there were Venezuelan diplomats who were on there as well, and it was great to be part of that webinar discussion. I learned a lot from listening to the Venezuelans and from Tim Anderson, and it was great to engage with people. Australia is a great place. I got to get to Australia. When this whole thing is over, I got to get myself on a plane and get over there because there's so many great revolutionaries in Australia. I mean, I meet new great revolutionary people in Australia all the time. Really great stuff. Now, David Fox asked about quality into quantity, right? And that's a concept that comes from Hegel, right? That small changes add up to big changes, right? If you have a book, right, and you rip a page out of it, it becomes a book without a page in it. You rip out another book, it's a book missing 2 pages. It's still a book, but it has no pages in it. But if you just keep ripping out pages, one after the other, pretty soon, there's no pages left. And if it has no pages, it's no longer a book. It's gone from changing the quality of the book, it's just a book missing pages, to changing the quantity. Now there's no book, right? And that's when little changes add up to big changes. And I think some could look at the crisis that we're facing right now in the United States and say quality into quantity, right? That the black community has suffered so many outrages, and the economic crisis is coming down, and this is quality into quantity, right? I mean, I assume that's what David Fox was reading into this, and that's a Hegelian concept. It shows up in the understanding of dialectical materialism that is so important to those of us who understand Marxism: quality into quantity, quantity into quality, right? So there you go. Okay, who is the Falun Gong? The Falun Gong is a religious cult that seeks to overthrow the Chinese government. It's weird. The Chinese government has an interesting relationship with traditional Chinese medicine, right? For thousands of years, people in China have been eating certain herbs that they believe will help them. There's the concept of qi, right? And it's this concept that you have an energy through your body. It's called qi. Acupuncture comes from traditional Chinese medicine that, people stick needles and they think they can stimulate the qi and stuff like that. This was so widely practiced at the time of the Chinese Revolution. The question was, what would be the Chinese Communist Party's position on it? And Mao's position was basically they supported it, they just didn't support the religious beliefs that went along with it, right? And, the Red Army, they would do acupuncture, and they would do traditional Chinese medicine, burning herbs and stuff like that. They just weren't allowed to worship, spirits and deities, and they weren't allowed to promote the religious superstitions that came along with this, but they were allowed to practice it. And especially during the 1970s and the Cultural Revolution, they really started promoting acupuncture in China. To the point that there's actually in Edgar Snow's last book. Edgar Snow was a great American journalist who went to China many times. His last book is called The Long Revolution. There's a chapter in it called Abortion with Acupuncture, and it talks about how there was a woman having an abortion, and the only anesthetic she needed was acupuncture because they were able to numb her with acupuncture. It's a little bit strange. And there's a famous film called Mao Curing Deaf Mutes, where they were able to cure people that were deaf and couldn't speak through acupuncture. And that was seen as a great accomplishment of Mao Zedong thought. So that was kind of a weird relationship where Mao believed in traditional Chinese medicine, but also rejected the spiritual beliefs that went with it. And there's actually somebody I know who wrote their college thesis on this very question. Because it was weird, right? I mean, it didn't fit. You would think traditional Marxists would be purely scientific. We reject traditional Chinese medicine. Well, that wasn't the case. In the 80s, the Chinese Communist Party changed its position. The Chinese Communist Party in the 80s stopped believing in traditional Chinese medicine. So there was this guy who was in the Chinese Communist Party who was a big believer in traditional Chinese medicine who quit the Chinese Communist Party and started a cult. His name was Li Hongzhi. And he became a cult leader in China, basically. I mean, it was just classic cult stuff. He was sent on a mission from God to Earth. He was the, reincarnation of Buddha. It was a Dharma ending period. He was going to save China from the evils of communism. Communism had rejected spiritualism, and he was going to save China from its spiritual crisis. And this guy, Li Hongzhi, that started the Falun Gong, I mean, he's a right-wing extremist. He calls for there was a debate in his movement. Should you publicly castrate homosexuals or just execute, just give them the death penalty? Or should we just have a public castration ceremony for anyone who's gay? Yeah, real, interesting debate. Got to debate these things, right? I mean, disgusting. Just a disgusting group. Family is a big part of traditional Chinese culture. They really emphasize, filial piety and loyalty to the family. But when they would join his cult, they couldn't speak to their family members. Their family members would get these mysterious calls from someone who would call them and say, Mom and Dad, you must join the movement. I'm not allowed to speak to you until you join with us. It was awful, tearing apart families and all of that. And then he would destabilize the country. And he started using the internet to do it. In the 90s especially, the internet was very new. The internet was very, very new, and I'm writing it down, Muslims in China. All right, and the internet was very, very new, and he was using these protests to destabilize the country, and they cracked down on the Falun Gong. They outlawed the Falun Gong. So the leaders of the Falun Gong came to the United States. A lot of them had already been here, which is a little bit interesting. People wonder if they were CIA all along. But regardless, yeah, it's an anti-government group in China. They're fanatics. They run Epoch Times newspaper. And I've noticed that they reserve their more hardline beliefs for their Chinese adherents. There's a lot of Westerners who've become Falun Gong. They think it's a great way to meditate. They go to yoga. It's basically yoga classes, but it's different than yoga. It's more like Tai Chi kind of stuff. But, they find it very, very spiritual. Socialism in Africa, writing it down. They find it very, very spiritual. It's kind of like, Eastern mysticism, meditation, stuff like that. But for their Chinese members, it's this fanatical group. And one of their main beliefs is that women should not be able to vote, right? In China, women vote. And Li Hongzhi said that that's the sign that China's entered a Dharma ending period, because according to traditional Buddhist beliefs, women should not vote. And essentially, when it all gets down to Falun Gong, they believe that you have this magical wheel in your stomach. Writing it down, market socialism. You have a magical wheel in your stomach. And that by doing the exercises of the Falun Gong, their exercise and meditation beliefs, you will go to heaven. That's what they believe, and that the Chinese Communist Party, because they're atheists, because they don't believe in traditional Chinese medicine, they are the scum of the earth. They are the enemy. That's basically what the Chinese Communist, that's what the Falun Gong believes. And they, at this point, because they are like the main anti-China activist group in the United States, they are anti-China activists and fanatics. Because of that, they have kind of, had an upsurge amid this anti-China stuff. So that's who the Falun Gong is. It's interesting, their history. It's interesting about Mao's history with traditional medicine. A lot of people don't know that. I think that's fascinating. But yeah, that's who they are. I mean, there's not much more to it than that. I know a lot of people, in the Chinese community, there are many people who are anti-Chinese government, think the Chinese government's awful and all of that, but also hate the Falun Gong. The Tibet separatists hate the Falun Gong, for example. There's a lot of, KMT, Taiwan kind of people, or people that are Taiwan independence activists, that the Falun Gong is such a dangerous cult. I mean, they demand that you abandon your family and give all your money to them and live with them. And I mean, they're a dangerous fanatical cult, right? I mean, when people look at them and think they could be suicide bombers or something, like they're nuts, right? It's people look at them and think of, think that they're crazy. They call themselves in the United States the Falun Dafa, because Falun Gong is in China, but it's the same group. Opinions on Tito. Wow. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. So that's Falun Gong. I got a lot of these to get through, and you guys keep sending them in, so we'll just keep talking about it. Robespierre was a leader of the French Revolution. People blame him for the Great Terror. The execution of Robespierre was kind of seen as a turning point. Robespierre was executed, I believe. John Paul Marat was stabbed in his bathtub. Very famous painting. John Paul Marat was like the agitator, the journalist agitator of the French Revolution. During the Revolution, he hid in sewers, so he got his skin infected with diseases from hiding in the sewers, and so he would sit in the bathtub all day so he didn't itch from his skin disease. And he was stabbed to death. And that, after the French Revolution, you had the Reign of Terror. You had this moment where it was like they executed the nobility. Anyone who'd been part of the nobility, they gave the death penalty to. And it was the Reign of Terror, and a lot of people got killed, and different revolutionary factions fought each other. And it was particularly ugly. And the way the Reign of Terror was ended was with Thermidor, right? When Napoleon marched into power. And that was a moment where the revolution was put on hold, right? During the French Revolution, right? At the beginning, France had been a Catholic country, and it had had an absolute monarchy, right? It had had the feudal system, the traditional feudal system. There was an economic crisis. There was, food shortages and things like that. And one thing led to another, and pretty soon they stormed the Bastille, which was this prison. And it only had like 5 people in it, but it was this prison that was famous as like a symbol of the king's terror. If you were a person the king didn't like, you got sent to this place called the Bastille, and they would torture you in awful ways, right? And it's not clear. There were all these urban legends about it, and people thought there were all these myths and legends about how they tortured people there or whatever. But regardless, it was this awful place, the Bastille. And there were only like 5 people in it, but at the time, but it was like symbolic. They raided the Bastille. The crowd stormed it and freed all the prisoners. One of the prisoners was Marquis de Sade at the time, right? Who was this famous French pornography writer. Barely anyone was in it at the time they stormed it. It was just kind of symbolic. They stormed the Bastille. There was a march to Versailles. They marched to the king's palace and arrested the king. And it was this uprising, right? And the National Assembly, which was, which represented the French population, mainly the French capitalists, took power. Then you had the revolutionaries, the capitalists of France, divided into 2 factions: the Jacobins, which were the more radical faction, and the Girondists. There was fighting between the 2 factions. The Jacobins were considered the left faction. Girondists were considered the right-wing faction, or more conservative faction. They immediately got invaded by other countries, and so they're fighting for the revolution around the world. And that there was, at that point, they outlawed religion, right? They said religion was the king. It was this old feudal thing, and they converted all the churches to temples of reason, they called them, right? And they weren't, the word atheist comes out of the French Revolution, but a lot of them weren't atheists. They were like pagan pantheists. They worshiped nature. They did different things. There were a lot of different beliefs, but they executed people in a lot of numbers. They were atheist or pantheist or anti-Catholic. A lot of killing going on. They would just cut people's heads off, with the guillotine in public, and the crowds would cheer, and it was very bloody. A lot of killing and a lot of executions and a lot of terror and a lot of awful things going on, but they were ripping apart feudalism and creating capitalism. So then, amid the chaos, Napoleon, who was a military leader, marched in and took over, right? And Napoleon took over, and he ended the chaos. I like the way that China has so many environmental problems, including really bad air for so many pollution there. All right, we'll talk about bad air in China. We'll talk about it. It's a weird super chats we're getting. Some of these are normal and some of these are weird, but whatever. Don't care. Yeah, so Napoleon marched in, right? And he basically ended the reign of terror. And he made the Catholic Church, he restored the Catholic Church, and he adopted the concept of meritocracy. And he didn't go back to feudalism. He didn't create capital. He didn't go back to feudalism. He maintained capitalism, right? And he there was land. The commons were broken up. The lords were removed, and they started having private ownership in capitalist markets. But he declared himself emperor. It was kind of a military dictatorship under Napoleon. And so it was like they compromised with the old system. They brought back the Catholic Church, and that's actually why the Catholic Church outlawed abortion and birth control, was because so many people had died in the French Revolution. Napoleon made the deal with the Pope that he was going to bring the Pope back to France, but the Pope had to, outlaw abortion and birth control. And that was the deal. And so that's why the Catholic Church officially opposes abortion and birth control. It was to repopulate the country. It was the new capitalist France that came in, and Napoleon solidified it. If they had continued with the Jacobin, the reign of terror, it was so unstable and so many people were dying that there would have been feudalism. So you needed that moment where the revolution slows down and compromises with the old system a little bit. Stalin was a lot like Napoleon, right? Stalin did not overturn the Russian Revolution, but he solidified it, right? At the beginning, the Bolsheviks were so out of touch with the Russian population, right? The Russian people had been very traditional for thousands of years, very conservative and religious. The Bolsheviks came in and were legalizing homosexuality and legalizing free love and abortion, and were doing a lot of stuff, and they blew up churches and were doing all this stuff that was very extreme. Well, Stalin came in, right? And he started glorifying the Soviet family, and he made the cult of Lenin. Lenin was like the new saint, basically, and put him in a mausoleum. And he kept socialism. Stalin didn't get rid of socialism, but he adjusted socialism to not be so radical that it left the population behind, right? That's what Stalin did. And Stalin was a lot like Napoleon, but it made sense. It was necessary. What Napoleon did after the French Revolution was necessary. If the Jacobins had stayed in power, right, it would have gotten too crazy, right? So, that's the thing. And the revolutions go through these scales. There's actually a very good book published in 1938 called The Anatomy of a Revolution. CIA-funded cults. Okay, all right. Here, I'm just going to rip a page out of here so I can keep writing these down. All right. CIA-funded cults. All righty. But yeah, that's kind of what it was. And Stalin solidified the Russian Revolution, just like Napoleon solidified the French Revolution, right? That was basically what happened. And Robespierre represented the radical period of the French Revolution that wasn't stable. But a lot of his writing, and his views and his rhetoric kind of laid the basis for modern France. The same with John Paul Marat, right? These people were bloody, violent revolutionaries, but they were talking about human rights. Actually, there's a very good song, the play that I really like about the French Revolution is called Marat Sade. It's a very good revolutionary play. It's about a debate between this pornographer, Marquis de Sade, and John Paul Marat, the revolutionary agitator. And there's a line in the play, about John Paul Marat. It says, screaming in language that no one understands of these rights that we grabbed with our own bleeding hands. And that's kind of, yeah. I mean, you can look at Robespierre and Jacobin and all, and the Jacobins and Jean Paul Marat and the leaders, the agitators of the French Revolution is kind of, yeah, they were way ahead of their time. They're talking about human rights and liberty, and they, on some level, they were even almost early communists, right? I mean, they were not Marxists, they were not scientific socialists even, but they wanted to create some kind of egalitarian, classless world, right? And the basis of the French Revolution was the sans culotte, those without shoes, the poor people, and they were very good at mobilizing the very, very poor people, and they really, on some level, believed that they could not only overthrow feudalism, but they would build heaven on earth. Well, they weren't able to do it. They weren't able to do it. If Napoleon hadn't come in, feudalism would have overtaken them, right? In order to stabilize the revolution, you needed to take some retreats. And Stalin understood that with the Russian Revolution, right? That they couldn't be radical, far liberal. What the Bolsheviks were doing in the 1920s wasn't going to work. Stalin came in and he figured out a model that would work in Russia at that time. 1928, what Trotsky, who hated Stalin, calls the year of Thermidor. It was, but it was a necessary Thermidor, right? Stalin understood that the Russian people and Russian socialism had to be run this way, and that what Trotsky had been doing, and what the workers' opposition had been doing, and what Alexandria Kollontai, what these people had been advocating, would have led to the overthrow of socialism in Russia. And I think that's what you can take out of that. I know it's a long answer. Grover Furr, he's a writer. He's a professor in New Jersey. He teaches at Montclair State, New Jersey. He wrote a book called Khrushchev Lied, in which he investigates the secret speech by Khrushchev. Interesting stuff. The book of Grover Furr's that I like the most is called Blood Lies. And the book Blood Lies, it's a response to Timothy Snyder. Timothy Snyder is a Yale professor, and he is in the business of defending the Nazis in World War II, basically. He writes books basically denouncing the role of Russia in World War II. And he denounces the Nazis also, but it's like, hint, hint, it's like, well, sure, the Nazis were bad, but they weren't as bad as those communists, right? I mean, that's Timothy Snyder, and he's the head of Russian studies at Yale, for Christ's sakes. And his book, Blood Lands, right? Blood Lands by Timothy Snyder. According to Grover Furr, if you read Grover Furr's, critique of it, and he did it in an academic investigation, the book is full of lies. And that he misrepresents his research. He just lies. He lies. Grover Furr shows, for example, that Timothy Snyder claims that Soviet soldiers frequently raped women, but his source that he uses actually shows that there was an instance of rape, and the soldier who did it got the death penalty. Right? So that's very different, right? And that Snyder, his sources don't match what's in the book. Right? It's an interesting book, and he goes over a lot of points. He talks about Poland. He talks about a lot of things. And he just shows that Timothy Snyder misrepresents his sources and is basically trying to rewrite the history of World War II to make the Nazis look good, right? I mean, what David Irving did by trying to deny the Holocaust, Timothy Snyder is kind of sort of doing in a softer way. And that this is happening all over Europe, right? They're tearing down World War II memorials, for example. That's happening all over Europe. They're tearing down World War II memorials in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Ukraine. They're demonizing, they're demonizing heroic anti-Nazi fighters while reviving Nazi collaborators like Stepan Bandera. This is happening, right? And that's why, all these people who are just, I don't want to say too much about that. But regardless, right? It's important to note that there is a huge effort to malign the Soviet Union and the role that it played in World War II. The Soviet Union was amazingly heroic in World War II. It defeated the Nazis, it was building an anti-fascist front, and maligning that and rewriting history and trying to say that the Soviets were just as bad as Hitler or worse. That's historical revisionism, and the beneficiaries of it are white nationalists and white supremacists and neo-Nazis. So good for Grover. That's my favorite book by Grover. Blood Lies. That book is amazing. I read it and I loved it. I am a big fan of Grover Furr's book, Blood Lies. I've read his other stuff, Trotsky's Amalgams and stuff like that. It's interesting to me. It goes into very, very specific detail about stuff in the 1930s, and I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know enough to vouch for it. It's interesting. He makes strong arguments about Khrushchev and other things, but yeah, that Grover Furr book, Blood Lies, is by far my favorite. Okay, reparations. It's interesting. Reparations. right, as a demand among the black community. What it means is that the corporations that benefited from slavery, right, like J.P. Morgan Chase, there's many corporations. You can look at the list. The corporations that benefited from slavery, big Wall Street banks that benefited from slavery, that they have an obligation to the black community. I agree with that, right? The corporations that benefited from slavery, that enriched themselves with the slave trade, most Wall Street institutions, that's what Wall Street did. It insured the slave ships. It insured the cotton exports to Britain. I mean, Wall Street had a slave market on it. That's